Sienna God, hello all. Good afternoon, and Wano. Thank you for watching. This is day 18, part B of reading Black Rednecks and White Liberals by Thomas Sowell. Happy Independence Day. Happy 205th America. America. All right, here again, the vocabulary of the prevailing vision must neutralize or evade the plain fact that some people achieve better than others by describing the means of their achievements as quote-unquote advantages. If the very concept of achievement is a threat to the vision, then overcoming adversity is even more of a threat. Both must be verbally transformed into privileges and advantages in order to protect the vision. Conversely, the failure of particular people to achieve is often transformed verbally into a denial of quote-unquote access or quote-unquote opportunity to them by others. Those who do not meet the same standards for college admissions or mortgage loans as often as others do are said to be denied an quote-unquote opportunity for higher education or quote-unquote access to loans to buy a home. Any adverse information on such groups must be verbally transformed into quote-unquote stereotypes or quote-unquote myths. There simply cannot be any facts contrary to the vision. The vision has become part of the law of the land, so that an American employer can be found guilty of discrimination without a speck of evidence of discrimination against any specific individual as true. If the demographic makeup of his workforce differs from what prevailing preconceptions say, it would be in the absence of discrimination. The absurd limit to which this vocabulary can go is illustrated by scholarly, or at least academic studies of Malaysia that describe the Malays as a quote-unquote deprived group there and non-Malay minorities as having quote-unquote privilege, because the latter have had greater economic success than the Malay majority, which controls the government and which is guaranteed various benefits that are denied to non-Malays. Quote-unquote prejudice is another word that has been distorted beyond recognition in order to sustain a vision. The straightforward meaning of prejudice, prejudgment, is in an ethnic or racial context, stretched and twisted to mean any adverse opinion about a minority group. This implicitly assumes that any unfavorable judgment about the behavior or performance of any minorities cannot have any factual basis, and so can only be explained as being a result of a prejudgment. Excuse me. But when German Jews in America were socially accepted into many elite circles from which all Jews were later barred after an influx of Eastern European Jews, the origins of these barriers cannot have been anti-Jewish prejudice as such, though the persistence of such barriers long after Eastern European Jews had become acculturated to American society shows the weight of inertia. Similarly, blacks lived in white neighborhoods in many northern cities in the late 19th century, and their children went to racially integrated schools before the massive influx of blacks from the South at the beginning of the 20th century. Can the change to racial segregation in both housing and schools be attributed to prejudice or to experience? To say that it must have been prejudice is itself a prejudgment. Again, inertia would cause these adverse reactions to outlast circumstances excuse me, which gave rise to them and to apply to individuals quite different from those whose behavior provoked racial barriers in the first place. Blacks are by no means the only ethnic group whose advancement has been promoted by its own internal transformations, with greater acceptance by the surrounding population being in effect more so than a cause of group's advancement. Acculturated German Jews who had achieved respectability and social acceptance in 19th century America lamented the arrival of masses of Eastern European Jews who were far less acculturated, less educated, and were often poverty-stricken. The German Jews' fear, which proved to be well-founded, was that the arrival of huge numbers of such people, foreign in appearance and repellent in behavior to American society at large, would lead to hostility and barriers against all Jews. This understanding led, among other things, to organize attempts by German Jews to assimilate the Eastern European Jews to American standards of behavior, cleanliness, and lifestyle. This internal transformation of the Jewish population led over the years to lessening hostility and greater acceptance by the American population as a whole. Again, this did not mean that there were no inveterate, inveterate anti-Semites who would be hostile to Jews in spite of anything that the latter could do. But neither can hostility to Jews after the arrival of vast numbers from Eastern Europe be explained as simply an arbitrary prejudice especially coming after German Jews had already been accepted even in the higher reaches of society. In the case of immigrants from Ireland, the massive efforts of the Catholic Church in the 19th century to Americanize Irish immigrants are seldom mentioned among the reasons why the quote-unquote "no Irish need apply" signs faded away during the 20th century. The picture too often presented might lead one to believe that it was all just a matter of prejudice and bigotry in American society that led to such signs in the first place, leaving their disappearance in later times unexplained except by some such generality as quote-unquote progress, or by the efforts of the enlightened to dispel such prejudices and bigotry. The very possibility that the Irish themselves were different in the 20th century from what they had been in the 19th century is too often passed over in silence. The long social struggle that led to this result virtually disappears from history, as seen by those who make quote-unquote prejudice an all-purpose explanation. This not only deprives these and other minorities of credit for past improvements, more importantly, it deprives others today of a potentially valuable example of ways of improving their own futures. Strained terminology such as quote-unquote prejudice is just one aspect of the power of a vision. A prevailing vision can become the default setting for thought and action. Assertions consistent with the vision can be made without meeting the additional requirement that they be consistent with the facts. Well, yeah. Indeed, facts themselves may be viewed suspiciously, right, or subjected to higher standards of proof, yes, when they are inconsistent with the vision. Achievements have preconditions, and those preconditions, whether internal to those seeking achievement or external aspect of the surrounding world, would need to be considered. Redefining achievements out of existence avoids all these complications that distract from ideological visions and political agendas. But neither internal nor external preconditions can be ignored if we are serious about history and its integrity as a record that can be relied on when weighing present-day alternatives. The history of groups and whole nations that rose from poverty to prosperity is especially valuable for those who would like to see today's lagging groups advance. But the experiences of such groups are an especially dangerous threat to those with a vision of external causation. Immigrants from Asia to various countries around the world have been prominent among groups that have risen from poverty to prosperity, often in the face of racial discrimination. One of the remarkable things about people from China and India has long been that they have prospered in countries around the world, except in their own homelands. Even with all due allowance for selective migration, the immigrants, including more than their share of able and ambitious people, there has still been a striking contrast between the ethnic Chinese economic domination of the economies of a number of Southeast Asian countries and the poverty of the Chinese in China. As late as 1994, the 36 million quote-unquote overseas Chinese produced as much wealth as the billion people living in China itself. Immigrants from India living in the United States average higher incomes than the American population. People of Japanese ancestry have likewise had higher incomes than the average American in the United States, and higher than the average Canadian in Canada. While in Brazil, they have owned 3/4 as much land as there is in Japan. Oh, dang. In all these cases, economic success stories began in poverty. At the beginning of the 20th century, Japanese immigrants to the United States were domestic servants and agricultural field hands to an even greater extent than Black Americans. As late as 1920, a majority of all the Chinese living in the United States were either laundry workers or restaurant workers. Most overseas Indians began their careers in the 19th century in East Africa, Fiji, Trinidad, and Guyana as indentured laborers. In more recent times, Korean immigrants to the United States have likewise begun at the bottom and progressed upward into small businesses and their children into the professions. While some may regard such experiences as inspiring and a heartening example of what can be done to overcome poverty, to those with a vested interest in the prevailing vision in the media and in academic quote-unquote social science, including history, these stories undermine their fundamental beliefs and the general thrust of welfare state government. To the political representatives of other groups that are still lagging behind the general economic and social levels of their societies at large, the success of Asian immigrants is resented. Whether to Maoris in New Zealand or blacks in the United States, Asian immigrant success stories are bitter medicine. The stirring up of animosity and even violence toward Asian quote-unquote bloodsuckers by racial activists is just one consequence of this. At higher intellectual levels, the rise of Asian immigrants from poverty is often glided over in silence when portraying less successful groups as victims of arbitrary barriers based on race, or when depicting external circumstances in general as decisive factors in group advancement. Still less does the success of Asian immigrants support the view that protests and politics are key requirements for raising lagging groups out of poverty. Any reasonably informed American, for example, can far more easily name 5 prominent black leaders than they can name even one prominent Chinese American or Japanese American leader. The fact that the Chinese have long prospered better outside of China and Indians outside of India undermines the multicultural view that Western prosperity in general is not due to any superior features of Western institutions. The fact that both China and India have had sharp upturns in their economic growth rates after they began transforming their economies in the direction of Western capitalism toward the end of the 20th century provides further evidence against current efforts at promoting a neutral agnosticism about differences among societies. It is not just ethnic minorities whose fates tend to be explained or explained away by external circumstances in keeping with prevailing vision among intellectuals. So have behavior patterns among Southern whites. Cotton has created another culture pattern for the South. The seasonal and cyclical nature of his money not only serves to give the cotton grower a shifting standard of living, but throws him back upon credit and prevents his acquiring habits of thrift. After a season of deprivation and closed living on niggardly credit, comes the sale of the crop and cash income to be husbanded, if possible, until the sale of next year's crop. The income of the cotton grower has its peaks of high prices, but these peaks are not planned for, and they do not serve to level up the general standard of living. In the Cotton Belt, luxuries are likely to be bought on the spur of the moment during a good season in cotton and to be paid for in the poverty of next year's living. One can neither exercise a systematic thrift, budget expenses, nor indulge in installment buying on irregular returns from cotton. And that's how our farmers are now anyway. And I believe that the farmers are like that worldwide. They're constantly in these like astronomical amounts of debt that like you can't even think. You can't being just like a normal person going out doing your farming and you're like $1 million in debt, right? And you're hoping to at least break even with your crop. You know what I mean? And that's who's supplying our foodstuffs. Anyway, this ignores the fact that the ancestors of these people lived in the same spur of the moment way on the other side of the Atlantic in places where cotton did not grow. But once an external explanation of behavior is available, internal explanations are seldom sought, and weighing the two against one another is rarer still. That is what is meant by saying that the prevailing vision is the default setting for many. Poverty is one of the most widely used external explanations of intergroup differences, but like other external explanations, it is seldom tested empirically against alternative internal explanations. Many poor groups lag in intellectual development, but others do not. As noted in an earlier essay, poor Jewish immigrants in the earlier 20th century made use of free public libraries in New York, and the books they checked out were primarily serious works, while lighter and more popular books were left gathering dust on the library shelves. Among their ancestors in Eastern Europe a century earlier, even the poorest somehow managed to have books in their homes, while the larger population around them were overwhelmingly illiterate. A similar pattern was found among the people in the 18th century Scotland. Even a person of relatively modest means had his own collection of books, and what he couldn't afford he could get at the local lending library, which by 1750 virtually every town of any size enjoyed. At about the same time, on the other side of the Atlantic, Thomas Jefferson was complaining that there was not a single bookstore in his vicinity, and a century later, Frederick Law Olmsted, Olmsted, commented on how seldom he saw books, even in the homes of Southerners who could have afforded them. Still later, in the 20th century, E. Franklin Frazier commented on how seldom even black college faculty read books. Weird. Nothing better illustrates the dominance of unsubstantiated dogma over empirical evidence than the pervasive belief that the advancement of economically or socially lagging groups requires a sense of group pride, identity, and self-esteem, and that quote-unquote self-hate must be exterminated as a barrier to such advance. The plausibility of this belief is not in question. What is open to various serious question is whether or not it is supported by any hard evidence, yet such evidence is seldom asked for or given. Putting aside for the moment the emotionally loaded terms of such discussions, is it in fact the case that groups which exhibit pride and identity advance faster or further than groups which see themselves as inferior in achievements, knowledge, and sophistication to some other groups whose progress they wish to emulate? Well, the mind is extremely powerful. So, like, it believes anything that you tell it. So if it's like, oh, woe is me, poor me. Like, for example, I saw this thing come across my YouTube, excuse me. And it was a super short video talking about how sometime in Harvard, they conducted an experiment with like 7 guys. And the picture that was shown were these like men in their like late 70s and then like up to like 80s, right? And they were they looked like rundown. They had big bags, they had huge bellies. They took their labs and all that kind of stuff beforehand. They put them into this experiment that was like for 7 days. They had to live in this place that looked like it was from the 50s. The radio played 50s music, all the decor was 50s, and they had to wear 50s garb. And all they were supposed to do was like talk about their like the stuff from the 50s, right? And so they had these incredible stories and all these achievements and whatnot. When they emerged 7 days later, they took a photo and they showed strangers these photos, and it said it looked like they aged backwards. So they looked younger, healthier, and their lab work showed everything was in improvement, that they had taken years off their life, like as in they went back in time, right? So our minds are super duper powerful. Anyway, so that's why they're saying like, you know, age doesn't actually matter as far as like your health goes and stuff. It's what we're telling it, like, oh, I'm too old for that, I'm too tired, I'm too this, I'm too that. Well, then it starts believing that, and the body just follows with what the mind is doing. So essentially the mind ages, then the body follows, if that makes sense. Any serious investigation must begin with an understanding that we cannot see directly into the hearts and minds of other human beings. All that we can see are the outward manifestations. Exactly. The simple fact must be confronted at the outset as equally applicable to those who hold one belief rather than another, rather than have it surface at the end. When one set of beliefs has failed the empirical test and seeks escape by saying that we have not discussed quote-unquote real pride or quote-unquote real self-hate as they exist in the recesses of other people's minds. And we'll leave it at that. Don't go hang till we meet again. Love you, mean it.